This week on the Communicators, a discussion on how the internet is changing freedom of expression in areas of the world where governments attempt to stop free speech. Our guest is Rebecca MacKinnon of the New America Foundation.
We're now joined on the Communicators by Rebecca MacKinnon, a fellow with the New America Foundation. Rebecca MacKinnon, what is the Chinese Self-Discipline Awards?
The Chinese Self-Discipline Award is an award that's given out every year by the Internet Society of China. And what it's for is for the top 20 companies that do the best job at censoring content. So what goes on in China is China has a system where, it's not only censoring at the network level, so when you try and access a website, you suddenly get an error message or something like that. But, most people in China are using Chinese internet platforms. They're using the Chinese version of YouTube. They're using a Chinese company that has various social networking sites, various blog hosting platforms. And all of those companies are required by the government to police not only, porn or copyright stuff, which companies here have to do, but also police the platforms for a whole range of political content. And they get regular instructions from the authorities. And if they don't do a good enough job at keeping this stuff off their sites, they can lose their business license. And if they do a very good job, they get rewarded. And one of the rewards is this Self-Discipline Award.
Who sits on the Chinese Internet Society?
Well, the Internet Society of China it's officially a non-governmental organization, but it's actually sort of very closely aligned with the government. So it has actually the chairman of it is a computer scientist, but who's actually is not going to do anything the government doesn't want done.
Rebecca MacKinnon, how did you get interested in Chinese censorship on the internet issues?
Well, it goes way back. I used to work as a journalist in China. I worked for CNN there for many years, so I experienced it firsthand. I was there in China in the 90s when the internet first showed up there commercially in 1995. And very soon, there we were trying to use the internet to do our jobs, and we were finding we were getting blocked. So I've kind of experienced it as a user from the very beginning. But then after, make a long story short, I ended up leaving CNN in early 2004, and I was at Harvard, and I ended up spending quite a bit of time at something called the Berkman Center for Internet and Society. And I was looking at, the rise of citizen media and, blogging all around the world and how this is challenging journalism, how it's challenging governments, looking at it as a global phenomenon. But because I have this background in China, I speak Chinese, I read Chinese, I quickly became fascinated with what's happening in China and the fact that on the one hand, you have an explosion of internet use, you have all kinds of social networking sites, and you've got a lot of blogging going on. Yet at the same time, the government manages to control it well enough to prevent people from using the internet to organize an opposition. And the way in which they do that is fascinating. So because I had the language facility and because I was sort of starting to become interested, I wrote one thing, and then suddenly people started asking me to write more things and help them with research and give a talk, and then kind of suddenly before I knew it, I was an expert on Chinese internet censorship.
How do they block a Facebook or a Chinese equivalent of Facebook?
Well, so there's kind of several different levels of censorship in China. So we have Facebook itself, right? Facebook itself is not based in China. It's on computer servers outside of China. So for websites that are located outside of China, like Facebook, what they do is they basically instruct the network that when somebody types in www.facebook.com or some variant thereof, you get an error message. You just get blank in your browser.
And they can stop that at the border.
They can stop that at the border. So that's what happens with YouTube, it happens with Blogger, it happens with Twitter.com, it happens with tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of websites, or sometimes just certain pages. Because they have the ability to catch certain keywords and so on. And so there's a lot of stuff that's just blocked at the border, essentially, as you say. But that's just for the websites that are outside of China. So then you've got all these Chinese companies running Chinese versions, kind of Facebook clones or, various, Blogspot clones and, YouTube clones and whatever. And so they're not being blocked at the border because it's much more effective. Why just block something, which people who have the technical ability can figure out how to get around the blocks? Why block it when you can just take it off the internet? So for companies, if you're a Chinese internet company, your computer servers are inside China, you're in Chinese legal jurisdiction, the cops can show up at your facility and tell you to shut it down if you're not complying. And so you can tell the sites, okay, this particular group on the Chinese version of Facebook, needs to be shut down. These users need to be taken offline. This particular blog needs to be be shut down or deactivated, or people's particular blog posts. So for instance, I kind of did a test on this recently. A Chinese gentleman named Liu Xiaobo just got the Nobel Peace Prize. And so a couple different things happened with that, right? So overseas websites that talked about Liu Xiaobo and the news of him getting the Nobel Peace Prize, they were of course blocked. So you couldn't access them.
So in New York Times,
right.
You couldn't go to New York Times or CNN?
Well, New York Times in English, they're not so worried about because
Okay.
it's kind of a small elite, stuff isn't going to go viral in English.
Okay.
They're really worried about the Chinese stuff, so like Voice of America Chinese, BBC Chinese, and so on. But on the Chinese platforms, so let's say I have a bunch of accounts on some Chinese social networking services and Chinese blogging services. So I logged in and I took an article
From
about
here?
Liu Xiaobo. Yeah. I logged in, took an article about Liu Xiaobo, pasted it into the little, compose your blog post here box, hit publish, right? And you get an error message saying, we're sorry, you cannot publish this material. It contains sensitive words. So certain kinds of content you can't even get on the internet, or there were other services where I managed to publish it, but within minutes, it would disappear. And then you go back to the place where you had published it, and there's this notice saying, we're sorry, but the content you're looking for does not exist. And so you have, oh, I'm sorry, excuse me, I was just, let me just, yeah, so the content literally no longer exists in that spot. So basically you have a situation where it's not just blocking the content, but taking sensitive content off the internet completely.
So this is a Chinese policy. Within China, Chinese companies. Why should we care?
That's a very good question. I think there are a number of reasons. One is that China is a model, really, for how a government uses private companies as an extension of its power. And obviously China is the most extreme case, but there are a lot of governments who are kind of seeing this and seeking to duplicate it in various ways. It's also something of a cautionary tale about the way in which private intermediaries can be used in an opaque way to manipulate speech and to conduct surveillance, and why it's very, very important that this digital layer that we're all depending on now for our speech, that the way, obviously you need to have some kind of governance of this space. You need to keep pornographers from, there's all kinds of reasons why a company, why it's a good thing that Facebook is keeping, certain types of people off their site. But, how do we ensure that this privately operated layer is not doing things that infringe upon our rights, either at the behest of governments or on their own, which diminish our ability to voice dissent and to organize politically and so on. And of course, I'm by no means equating the United States and China. Their system and what they're doing has no basis in consent of the governed. But there are, I think, some concerns that people have in the U.S. And in other democracies about the extent to which there's going to be sufficient due process in the mechanisms that we set up. You know, you have democratically elected politicians who are passing laws or requiring technical specifications so that we can, you know, fight crime, we can guard against cyber attacks, we can protect children, we can protect intellectual property. These are all admirable goals. But how are we, what kind of system are we setting up? How can it be abused if you have a government that is seeking to abuse its power? Is the system transparent and accountable enough that you can correct for that? That's, I think, the real challenge we have in democracies.
And about a year ago, you wrote a column for McClatchy News Service. Are China's demands for internet self-discipline spreading to the West? Are they? Do you see that? Do you see evidence of that?
Well, again, it's a much more subtle thing. So there's a lot of debate in the West right now about the extent to which private intermediaries should be held liable for what their users are doing on the site. And because part of what goes on in a place like China is that the government sets out rules and then it's kind of left to the companies to decide, oh, you know, I better take this content down because it might get me in trouble. So you have a situation where companies are actually anticipating whether something may or may not be illegal, and they're taking it off. You know, it might actually not be a violation of the law, but just to be safe, they take it down. And so if you impose too much liability on intermediaries, even for ostensibly good reasons, you could have a situation where intermediaries are taking things down that actually have a pretty good case that, you know, when really taken to court and challenged, that the person who put it up has a right to express that speech. And so the concern is about the erosion of people's ability to advocate opinions, to disseminate information that may not be particularly popular, but on the other hand, you know, they have a First Amendment right to say those things. And are we moving towards a situation where intermediaries are kind of making that decision just to be on the safe side before anybody's had their day in court? And this is why a lot of people are concerned about the Amazon case, for instance, with WikiLeaks, where Amazon kicked WikiLeaks off their service. They were perfectly within their legal rights to do that, within their terms of service. There's absolutely nothing, you know, legally wrong with what they did. But you have a situation, again, where you have a private entity deciding that, well, you know, maybe this person does have a First Amendment right to say this, but I don't want to wait for the case. This is too much trouble for me. I'm going to dump them now. And if collectively most private intermediaries end up doing that with their most controversial clients, then we do have a problem. So again, you know, it's subtle, and one does not want to go too far in drawing equal signs at all. But there is a continuum of issues, and you know, the other problem too is that, you know, this is a globally interconnected network, and so you have technical norms and legal norms that are set up in democracies that make sense within a context of a country that has very robust legal system, very robust protections. But if you take the same technical norms, technical standards, and dump them into Iran or Belarus, which has been happening actually, you know, you've got a bunch of cases where the mobile phone systems being sold by Western companies into Iran and Belarus, you know, came with legal intercept capabilities so that law enforcement could intercept conversations, which is required under European law and American law. So, you know, all this technology enables authorities to tag people. It's basically acceptable to most citizens of democracies within the confines of this legal and constitutional situation, but you take that same technology and you drop it into Iran and Belarus, you know, you've got a very effective surveillance system. And so this is also a problem, is that we're setting up norms that work better in some countries than in others, but they become the default in a world where you cannot count on governments and legal systems being on the side of the people.
Rebecca MacKinnon, Google, Facebook, and Bing have gotten, and other companies like that, search engines, have gotten quite a bit of criticism about their business practices in China. But should U.S. companies be setting foreign policy? Shouldn't they just be following the rules as determined by that nation?
Well, it's a difficult question. I mean, you know, there are issues related to corporate social responsibility that sometimes that can sometimes get quite murky, right? So there are people who talk, for instance, about, you know, if you take some other industries, say, for instance, a mining company that goes into a repressive regime, and the repressive regime says, you know, you have to allow our militias to do X, Y, and Z, you know, and to what extent should companies just go along with that, and to what extent are they facilitating human rights abuses? And there's beginning to be internationally a whole set of norms being set up for how, you know, there are codes of conduct about what companies shall not do, despite the fact that the local government wants you to allow their militias to, you know, or wants you to fund their militias. You know, even if that's the law, you know, that's a problem internationally. And so with companies around the world, I mean, it's a tough situation, right? Because on the one hand, the internet has brought tremendous change and empowerment to everywhere. And it's certainly, the people of China are much better off with the internet than without it. And to say that no company should be doing business in China is oversimplistic, and I don't support that idea. But I do think that companies need to be mindful of how they're going about doing business. So it's not a matter of being there or not being there, but it's about how you're engaging. So you had a situation early on where Yahoo went into China with a Chinese language email service that they hosted on computer servers inside Chinese jurisdiction, and lo and behold, they ended up being complicit in jailing several dissidents, because when the police showed up in Yahoo's Beijing office, if their Chinese staff refused to hand over the information, they too would go to jail. So, you know, that put them in a difficult position. When Google went in, they chose not to offer a Chinese version of Gmail so that they wouldn't be in that, and they decided to draw the line at, okay, we're not going to host user content inside China because we don't want to be in position of sharing it with the Chinese police, but we'll experiment with the censoring of the search engine kind of thing. And they did that for a few years, and then ended up deciding they didn't want to do that anymore, and moved their search engine out. And Microsoft is still in there with their search engine, and, you know, it's not being used by many people. They're trying to split the difference a little more in terms of notifying users that censorship is happening, and kind of telling the government we're only going to respond to legally binding requests, and we're not going to respond just to some random phone call from a cop. You know, we need a court order, this kind of thing, to at least try and say, look, this needs to be grounded in the rule of law. But it's tough. These are difficult situations for businesses, and sometimes it's very hard to know what the right thing is to do. But I think what we found with business and human rights and business and social responsibility in other sectors is that, look, you know, I could maximize my profits if I hire 12-year-olds and pollute the groundwater. But, you know, there are a whole set of social norms about why that is, you know, not something I should do, because I'm living in this society, and that, you know, over the long run, not only is that the moral thing not to do, but I will prosper as a business in the long run if I'm perceived as being a good company and if I'm actually doing things that are sustainable for the community. So companies, in the internet and technology space are going to need to think about what kind of internet are we contributing to? What kind of internet are we helping to create? If we just go along with whatever every government wants us to do, are we going to destroy the value of the internet in the first place? I mean, the whole value of the internet is that people can connect around the world. And if that gets destroyed, because people are saying, oh, well, in order to get in this market, I have to do this, that, and the other, you may end up destroying the value of the thing you're selling. So people definitely do need to think about the long run and also about their users. What you do in one country is going to have an impact on how users trust you in other countries. So if you're compromising people's freedom of speech and privacy in one market, people hear about it, and then they say, oh, well, I'm not sure if I want to use that company's service because such and such that happened in China.
Rebecca MacKinnon, how ubiquitous is the use of technology and the advancement of technology in China?
So China now has about 450 million internet users.
What, 1.5 billion population?
Yeah, it's kind of 1.3 or probably more than that now. I think they just did a census, so we'll probably get an upgrade on that. But yeah, somewhere approaching 1.5 million population. So it's less than half of Chinese people online yet. Mobile phone use is many more times that. I don't have the figure off of my head, the latest figure off the top of my head, but I think mobile phone use is like at 80%, or it's many times higher. So mobile phone penetration is very high, and you have a lot of internet services that kind of leverage that, assuming that people are maybe mainly using their phone, and then sort of like chat services that you can use through your SMS, but also interface with the internet and so on. So yeah, there's a lot of growth there, and so it's a very attractive market.
As a former journalist with CNN, did you ever have trouble doing a report? Did your reports that you would send out ever get censored, or were you ever encouraged not to do something?
Well, I got detained on quite a number of occasions. I got yelled at by the foreign ministry on a number of occasions. My boss got yelled at by the foreign ministry on a few occasions when he visited from headquarters. And at one point they threatened not to renew my visa. And a lot of access is kind of contingent on whether you behave. And so well, you didn't behave, so we're not going to give you an interview with such and such official, or we're not going to let you go to Tibet, or that kind of thing happens all the time. So there was a lot of that kind of thing. But I was there at a time, up until the very end, when we started being able to send compressed video out through the internet. Most of the time I was there, because I was there from 92 until 2001, most of the time there was 2 ways or 3 ways to get your video out of China. One was through a satellite uplink, which is controlled by the government. So if you said anything controversial, we had a technical error. The other way is to FedEx or air freight it to Hong Kong or Tokyo, and they do the satellite uplink to Atlanta. So, you're kind of planning in advance and so on. Then the third way was somebody gets on a plane. So there were, up until we got to the point where we could send compressed video through the internet, which really wasn't until 2000, for a bunch of reasons. We were handing tapes to interns to fly down to Hong Kong, and I did a bunch of runs to Hong Kong with tapes, on breaking news stories, because we couldn't feed them on the satellite because they would shut it down. So it was challenging. I mean, now you can send just a compressed video file through broadband. But most of the way they control your reporting is they control your access to people. So people they don't want reporters interviewing, they put under house arrest, that kind of thing, where they'll tell people you're not going to talk to journalists, or they find ways to keep you from getting at from getting access to things. So that's primarily.
So it doesn't sound like you won a lot of Chinese self-discipline awards while you were over there.
No, I didn't.
Is Hong Kong still free? I mean, I know it was recently rated as the #1 open economy, but when it comes to technology and the use of the internet, is it still a unique area in China?
Well, after Hong Kong reverted to Chinese rule in 1997, there was this deal was made between the British and the Chinese that the legal system and the political system in Hong Kong would not change for 50 years. And so Hong Kong still has free speech protections, so that the internet there is not censored. You can, access, and that's why Google moved to Hong Kong, is that they don't have this problem in Hong Kong. You've got all kinds of blogs. You've got, the Falun Gong religious sect, which is banned in China, has a big operation in Hong Kong. Every year they do big parades and demonstrations. They're on the street every day. Nobody's, as long as they don't violate the law, nobody can do anything about it. There are big pro-democracy demonstrations in Hong Kong every year. There are dissidents from mainland China living in Hong Kong. So there is that protection. The problem is that the media in Hong Kong is owned primarily by business concerns who have business interests in mainland China. So a lot of the, there's a certain amount of kind of self-censorship, or, different people call it different things and people debate how bad it is, but there are a lot of journalists in Hong Kong who complain that their editor told them not to pursue a particular story because the publisher, has a concern, has some other business in Beijing and might not get a license, so kind of told to tone it down on certain things.
And finally, Rebecca MacKinnon, what is Global Voices Online and the Global Network Initiative, and what's your involvement?
Okay, well, they're two very different things, despite both being called global. Global Voices Online is an international bloggers and citizen media network that I founded along with a dear friend and colleague of mine, Ethan Zuckerman, when I was up at Harvard at the Berkman Center for Internet and Society. And the idea is that, there are people all over the world using the internet to talk about all kinds of very interesting things. And when we started it in 2004, the idea was, look, there are all these bloggers in the Middle East or in Africa or around Asia who are talking about things happening in their countries that the media is not reporting on, just because, the media can only report so much, and et cetera, et cetera. But it's really hard to find these bloggers unless you know where to look. And then you have to know, well, who's credible? And this guy who says he's blogging about Lebanon, is he even in Lebanon? How do you know? And so we developed this kind of team of bloggers around the world who kind of curate what's the most interesting stuff coming out of different regions of the world, and got a little funding and started translating things back and forth. So we have people doing digests about, what's coming out of the Arabic blogosphere this week, and what are the hottest kind of conversations going on, or what's going on in the Russian blogosphere and the Russian internet. We've got several people who are following that. So it's a way to help people in the English-speaking world kind of get a better handle on the conversations that are happening online globally, and we've got a lot of volunteers who are translating back and forth into a lot of different languages. So it's a lot of fun. It's a nonprofit, and then Global Network Initiative is basically it's a multi-stakeholder initiative around free speech and privacy for the internet and telecommunications sector. So the idea was that we got together, it started coming together back in 2006 after Google, Yahoo, and Microsoft and Cisco got yelled at in Congress for what they'd been doing in China. And some human rights groups and some academics and some other free expression groups, the Center for Democracy and Technology and others sort of began to convene some conversations with companies about, look, there need to be some bottom line principles here that we can all agree on for what companies will and will not do when it comes to government requests for censorship and government's demands for surveillance and handing over user information and so on. And so over the course of several years, we hashed out a set of principles on free expression and privacy. And then Google, Yahoo, and Microsoft signed on. They agreed to be sort of evaluated over the extent to which they actually adhere to these things, and the first kind of evaluation is going to happen this year. So far, we're hoping that more companies will join. It's still early days, and I think it's still very much in the proof of concept stage.
Rebecca MacKinnon is a fellow with the New America Foundation. If people want to read your writings, where should they go?
Well, I have a blog at rconversation.com.
Letter R.
Letter R and then conversation. Or you can just Google my name, Rebecca MacKinnon, MacKinnon, and you'll get my blog and my Twitter feed and everything else.
We've been talking with her on the Communicators. Thank you.
Thank you.